She arrived in the city with nothing but a small suitcase and a heart full of dreams. The streets were busy, full of people moving quickly from one place to another, most of them too wrapped up in their own lives to notice anyone else. She had always imagined the city as a place of opportunity, where talent could be seen and appreciated, but the reality was harsher than she had imagined. Apartment rent was high, and every corner seemed to have someone selling something or performing for coins. She walked past these scenes with a mixture of hope and despair, trying to find her place in a world that felt both exciting and unforgiving. Her piano had been with her for years. It was old and slightly worn, but it was reliable, like an old friend. She carried it carefully wherever she could, knowing that it was not just an instrument, but her voice, her way of expressing everything she could not put into words. She remembered her family, far away, who had always encouraged her to follow her passion. But even their support could not make her hungry stomachs disappear or pay the bills that piled up each month. The city was glamorous and full of promise, but it had little patience for those who were not already established. She found temporary work at a small cafe, cleaning tables and washing dishes for hours that seemed endless. Her hands became rough from scrubbing and carrying heavy trays, but she never let the exhaustion take away her spirit. Every night, she would sit on the edge of her bed in the tiny, rented room and practice on her small, portable keyboard. The music was her escape, a place where no one could judge her by her empty wallet or tired eyes. Yet, she knew she needed to do more than just practice. She needed to show the world what she could do, to let her talent speak louder than her circumstances. One afternoon, as she walked through a busy street market, she noticed a small crowd gathered around a musician playing for tips. People tossed coins into his open case. Some smiled, some took photos, and some barely glanced at him as they moved along. She watched carefully, noting the way he carried himself, how he started softly, then built his music to fill the air, how he made even hurried pedestrians pause for a moment. She realized that it was not just the music itself, but the way he connected with the people around him that drew attention. She had the talent, she thought, but did she have the courage to put herself out there? That evening, she carried her keyboard carefully to a quiet corner near a busy cafe. She set it up on the pavement, plugged in a small speaker, and took a deep breath. The night was just beginning, and the streetlights cast a soft glow over the pavement. A few people passed by, some glancing curiously, others barely noticing her presence. She opened her music bag, took out a small sign that read, "Playing for food," and placed it next to her keyboard. Her hands shook slightly as she touched the keys. This was it. She had nothing to lose, and yet, everything felt fragile. The first notes were tentative, almost whispering, as if testing the air around her. A few coins clinked into her open case almost immediately, from a passerby who seemed to appreciate her courage more than her music at first. Others walked by, laughing quietly, some pointing and making jokes. She felt the sting of their laughter, but she did not stop. She told herself that her music was for those who would listen, and even if only one person paused and felt something, it would be enough. Slowly, the music grew stronger, her fingers moving with more confidence, each note carrying a piece of her heart. As the evening progressed, more people began to notice her. Some were curious, slowing down to see who was playing. The laughter of those who had mocked her at first faded into the background. She focused on the melody, letting the music flow naturally, pouring all of her emotions into the notes. Memories of her family, of long hours spent practicing alone, of the sacrifices she had made, all found their place in the tune. It was not just a performance. It was a story, her story, told without words, but with a depth that touched even the most hurried souls walking past. The first real applause came from a young man who had stopped to listen, a soft smile on his face as he tossed a few bills into her case. That small gesture was more powerful than she had imagined. It reminded her that the world still had kindness, that there were people who could feel and appreciate beauty even in unexpected places. Encouraged, she continued to play, her music filling the street, weaving through the sounds of chatter, footsteps, and distant traffic. Each note seemed to pull people closer, creating a small circle around her keyboard. a temporary world where her music ruled and judgments were left behind. As night deepened, the street grew quieter, but the circle around her remained. Some faces were familiar now, locals who had passed by multiple times, drawn back by the music. Others were strangers who had never seen her before, but stopped anyway, sensing something extraordinary in the simple, powerful way she played. She began to feel a connection she had never felt before in her life, a bond with people who didn't know her name but understood her through the language of music. It was a humbling, exhilarating feeling all at once, the kind that made her forget her hunger and exhaustion, if only for a little while. By the time she finally stopped to rest, the coins and bills in her case were more than she had dared to hope. But more important than the money was the feeling of being seen, of being heard. The laughter and doubt from earlier that day seemed distant, almost meaningless. She realized that courage was not about being unafraid, but about continuing despite fear. Her music had been her voice when words were impossible, her shield when the world seemed cold, and her bridge to strangers who became momentary companions in her journey. As she packed up her keyboard and prepared to head back to her small room, she looked around at the empty street and thought about tomorrow. She knew she would return, because this was not just a way to survive, but a way to live. The city was still vast and challenging, and many people would still doubt her. But for the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of hope, a quiet confidence that maybe, just maybe, her music could change things. And in that moment, carrying her keyboard through the silent streets, she walked not just with hunger in her stomach, but with a renewed sense of purpose in her heart. The next morning, she woke early, her body aching from hours of carrying the keyboard and her mind buzzing with thoughts from the previous evening. She had never expected her first performance to go as well as it did, but the small success was enough to spark a determination she had not felt in weeks. As she prepared a simple breakfast, she replayed the moments in her head, the way people had stopped, the coins that had clinked into her case, the soft applause from strangers. Each memory fueled her confidence, making her believe that she could do more, that maybe the city had room for her after all. After finishing her meal, she dressed quickly and gathered her belongings. Today, she decided, she would return to the same street corner. It was a busy area, but she wanted to test herself in the light of day, when the crowds would be larger, and the challenge of attracting attention would be even greater. As she walked, the streets seemed alive in a way she had not noticed before. The hum of traffic, the chatter of street vendors, the laughter of children playing in nearby parks. She felt a connection to the city now, a sense of belonging that had been absent before, even in the face of hardship. She arrived at her chosen spot and began setting up her keyboard. The sun shone brightly, casting long shadows across the pavement. People moved quickly past her, some glancing curiously, others with barely a second thought. She placed her small sign reading, "Playing for Food," carefully in front of the keyboard. As she touched the keys, a wave of nervousness hit her. The crowd today would be larger, more critical, and she could not help but wonder if her music would have the same effect. Still, she reminded herself that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. She began playing softly, her fingers brushing over the keys in a gentle melody. The notes were tentative at first, but as she felt the rhythm of the city around her, they grew stronger, more confident. People started to notice. A few stopped, curious about the music that rose above the noise of traffic. One man leaned against a lamppost, arms crossed, listening intently. A young woman carrying a shopping bag tilted her head, a smile forming as the melody wrapped around her. It was a slow process, each passerby deciding, often unconsciously, whether to stop or keep walking. She focused on the music, letting it tell her story, letting it speak in a language that transcended words. Minutes passed, and slowly, a small crowd began to gather. Some were children, drawn by the unfamiliar sound of live music in the busy street. Others were adults, initially skeptical but now caught in the pull of the performance. A few people still laughed quietly, perhaps doubting the seriousness of someone playing for food, but they were outnumbered by those who had stopped, enchanted by the sound. She noticed the coins and bills appearing in her open case, small signs of appreciation that gave her courage. The melody continued, evolving as she allowed her emotions to flow freely into the music. As she played, she observed the crowd more closely. One older man had tears glistening in his eyes, and she wondered what memory or feeling had stirred him. A group of teenagers stood quietly, their usual chatter replaced by attentive listening. Even the vendors selling food and trinkets seemed to pause, letting the music touch their busy minds. The way people responded, she realized, was not just about talent but about honesty, about the sincerity that came through in her fingers, in the way she allowed herself to be vulnerable. Her thoughts drifted to her past, to the countless hours spent practicing alone in her small room. She remembered the nights when she questioned her choices, when hunger and loneliness seemed to outweigh the joy of music. But now, seeing the effect her performance had on strangers, she felt a profound sense of purpose. Each note carried a piece of her journey, a piece of her heart, and each pause in the melody allowed the crowd to breathe and reflect. It was not just entertainment. It was a conversation without words, a connection between her and those who had stopped to listen. Suddenly, a little girl approached, holding a small coin in her hand. She looked up at the pianist with wide, curious eyes, and carefully placed the coin in the open case. The gesture, innocent and pure, touched her deeply. She smiled warmly at the child, and in return, the girl clapped lightly, a tiny sound that echoed like applause in the quiet street. Around them, the crowd seemed to lean in, as if even the smallest interaction mattered. She realized then that music was not only about the notes she played, but also about the way it could reach hearts, no matter how small or grand. The sun moved higher in the sky, and more people paused to listen. Some took videos on their phones, capturing the moment, while others simply stood, letting the melody wash over them. She felt a surge of energy, a connection that seemed almost magical. Even those who had walked by with skepticism earlier now nodded in appreciation or smiled quietly. For her, this was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment when doubt and laughter were replaced by acknowledgement and respect. The street, once just a pathway to somewhere else, had become a stage where her music could speak freely. Hours passed, and she continued to play, feeling the music in every fiber of her being. Occasionally, she paused to wipe her hands or take a breath, but the flow never stopped. Conversations in the crowd became whispers of admiration, and coins continued to fall into her case. She realized that she had created a small world, a space where music connected strangers and bridged the gap between uncertainty and belief. Her tired body and hungry stomach seemed insignificant compared to the joy of sharing her gift, the joy of touching lives even briefly. As the day began to turn toward evening, she finally allowed herself a moment of rest. She stepped back from the keyboard and looked at the crowd that had gathered, now dispersing slowly. Some waved or nodded goodbye, leaving small gifts of appreciation behind. She gathered her belongings, careful with her instrument, and felt a deep sense of accomplishment. Today had been more than just a performance. It had been a triumph over fear, over doubt, over the moments when she thought she might not belong in this vast city. Walking back to her small room, she reflected on the day. The laughter and skepticism from before seemed like a distant memory, replaced by the smiles and quiet nods of those who had truly seen her talent. She knew tomorrow would bring new challenges, new skeptics, and new moments of uncertainty. But she also knew that courage, honesty, and passion could create change, even in small corners of the world. As she entered her room and prepared a simple dinner, she felt a sense of hope she had not known in a long time. Her music had reached people, and in doing so, it had strengthened her own resolve. The city was still big and full of challenges, but she felt ready to face it again, one note at a time. The morning sun cast a soft glow over the city streets as she carried her keyboard to her usual spot. Today felt different. There was a quiet anticipation in the air, an invisible energy that seemed to hum along with her footsteps. She had learned from yesterday that music could capture attention, but today she wanted to reach deeper, to touch hearts in a way that would linger long after the notes faded. Setting up her keyboard carefully, she placed her familiar sign, "Playing for Food," in front. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the eagerness to pour everything she had into this performance. As she began to play, the first notes were soft, deliberate, as if testing the street for its receptivity. The sounds rose gradually, building confidence with every measure. Passers-by slowed down, some out of curiosity, others drawn by the unfamiliar beauty of the music. One man stopped, leaning against a lamppost, and closed his eyes, letting the melody wash over him. A young woman with a shopping bag tilted her head, a small smile forming as she listened. The crowd began to gather slowly, each person drawn in without even realizing it. She played with care, aware that every note could touch someone in ways words never could. The rhythm and flow of the music became bolder as she grew more comfortable, each key struck with purpose and emotion. She remembered the countless hours spent practicing alone in her room, the nights when exhaustion and hunger made her question her path. But now, with every note, she felt that all of those sacrifices were worthwhile. Her music was no longer just an escape. It was a bridge, connecting her life with the lives of those who paused to listen. People moved closer, forming a semicircle around her keyboard, their faces reflecting a mix of surprise, admiration, and quiet awe. A little boy tugged at his mother's hand, pointing at her keyboard with wide eyes. She smiled at him, her fingers never missing a beat, and let the melody speak for itself. The boy clapped lightly, and in that small gesture, she felt a ripple of connection that expanded to everyone watching. A man with a briefcase stopped mid-stride, captivated by the sound, and placed a few bills into her case. She noticed the change in the atmosphere. The earlier skepticism and laughter were replaced by quiet attention, by faces softened by emotion, by hearts opened by music. Her mind drifted briefly to her family, far away, who had always believed in her talent. She imagined them listening to her play, feeling the pride and love that could not be sent through letters or calls alone. It gave her strength, fueling her performance with a deeper intensity. She played faster now, the melody shifting from gentle notes to a cascading series of harmonies that seemed to dance in the air. People began to whisper among themselves, sharing looks of amazement, their previous hurried pace forgotten. The street had transformed, temporarily, into a sanctuary of sound where music alone dictated the mood. As she continued, she noticed subtle reactions from the crowd. An older woman brushed away a tear discreetly, touched by the familiarity and beauty of the music. A young man leaned in, visibly moved, perhaps reminded of a memory or a moment he had long forgotten. The city that had once seemed cold and indifferent now felt intimate, alive with shared experience. Even those who had been skeptical at first now listened with genuine interest, their attention drawn irresistibly by the sincerity and depth in her playing. She realized that the true power of her music was not only in technical skill but in its ability to convey emotion, to tell a story that words alone could never capture. Time seemed to blur as she immersed herself in the performance. She alternated between soft, delicate passages and strong, commanding sequences, letting her emotions guide the flow of the music. Coins continued to fall into her case, but she hardly noticed them. Each note, each pause, each change in tempo was more important than any material reward. She felt alive, completely present, as though the music had freed her from the constraints of worry and exhaustion. The city around her existed only as a backdrop to her story, and the people gathered were not strangers but participants in an unspoken dialogue of sound and feeling. A young woman in the crowd raised her phone, recording the performance, and she understood instinctively why. This moment was rare, a true display of vulnerability and talent in a place that rarely paused to notice such things. Another passerby stopped, a coffee cup in hand, and nodded in silent approval. Even the street vendors seemed to move with more care, as if honoring the music that now filled their surroundings. She played for hours, though it never felt like work. Each pause was a chance to breathe, to observe the faces around her, and to feel the connection grow stronger. Every coin and bill that touched her case was a token of gratitude. But the real gift was the shared human experience she could see reflected in the eyes of her audience. At one point, a group of teenagers lingered, initially skeptical, but soon captivated by the way her music shifted from soft, introspective notes to bold, expressive sequences. One of them whispered to a friend, their voices low, so as not to interrupt the flow, "She's amazing." She could not hear the words clearly, but the energy in the group shifted noticeably, their laughter replaced by focused attention. The crowd grew, a mix of old and young, locals and visitors, all united in a brief moment by the power of music. Her heart swelled with a mix of joy, pride, and humility, knowing that her passion had the ability to bridge differences and bring people together, if only for a short while. As the afternoon progressed, the sunlight softened and the shadows lengthened. She took a brief pause, letting her fingers rest on the keys, and looked around at the gathering crowd. Some faces were familiar, those who had stopped in previous days, returning to listen again. Others were new, drawn in by the music without prior knowledge. She realized that this simple act, playing music on a city street, had become something larger than herself. It was not just a means to survive, but a way to live fully, to create moments of beauty that mattered. The crowd's admiration was not merely for her skill but for the courage to show vulnerability, to perform honestly in the midst of an indifferent world. Refreshed by the short pause, she returned to her keyboard with renewed energy. The next piece she played was slower, filled with emotion, every note deliberate and heartfelt. She closed her eyes briefly, imagining the stories of those listening, the struggles, the dreams, the quiet moments of longing that music could touch. The reaction was immediate. Heads nodded, eyes softened, some mouths opened slightly in surprise at the depth of feeling. Coins and bills continued to fall into the case, but she barely noticed. She was no longer performing for recognition or sustenance alone. She was performing to connect, to communicate, to leave a lasting impression on hearts that might otherwise never hear such music in their busy, hurried lives. Hours slipped by, and eventually, she felt her energy wane. Yet, she did not stop abruptly. The final notes were soft, fading gently into the background hum of the city. The crowd remained for a moment, absorbing the last echoes of the performance, before slowly dispersing. Some lingered to offer words of thanks or appreciation, while others left quietly, carrying the memory of the music with them. She gathered her belongings carefully, her hands tired but her spirit invigorated. Today had been transformative, a step beyond simple survival, a moment where her talent and courage had created something extraordinary. As she walked home, her fingers still tingling from hours of playing, she reflected on the experience. The city had challenged her, tested her resilience, and yet it had also rewarded her honesty and dedication. She thought about the people she had touched, even briefly, and felt a profound sense of fulfillment. The street, once just a path to somewhere else, had become a stage for connection, a place where music transcended everyday worries. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but she felt ready, strengthened by the knowledge that her talent could resonate deeply, and that courage could transform even the most skeptical of hearts. In the quiet streets leading back to her room, she felt a sense of purpose more vivid than ever, a hope that the world could indeed respond to the music she had to offer. The city streets were alive again as she carried her keyboard to the corner where she had begun to feel at home. The morning air was cool and crisp, carrying the distant sounds of traffic, footsteps, and the occasional laughter of children playing. She could feel a quiet excitement bubbling inside her, an anticipation that today would be different. Over the past days, she had noticed the gradual change in the way people responded to her music. They no longer walked by with casual indifference or scorn. Today, she hoped to take that connection even further. Setting up her keyboard, she placed the familiar sign that read, "Playing for food," in front of her. Though she still felt a flicker of nervousness, it was tempered by a growing confidence born from the successes of the previous performances. She touched the keys lightly at first, letting a soft melody drift into the busy street. People passing by slowed instinctively, curiosity replacing the habitual rush of daily life. Her music began to weave into the atmosphere, blending with the hum of the city, yet standing out in its beauty and honesty. As she played, She observed the faces in the crowd, noticing a subtle transformation. A woman with a shopping bag stopped, eyes wide, as though she had been transported somewhere else. A man leaning against a lamppost had tears glistening in the corner of his eyes. Even the teenagers who had approached skeptically days before now watched quietly, their usual chatter silenced by the power of the music. Every note seemed to touch something deep within them, evoking emotions long buried or forgotten. She allowed herself to play with complete freedom, the melodies shifting from gentle, tender notes to bold, sweeping sequences that filled the street with energy. The crowd grew steadily, forming a loose circle around her. Coins and bills appeared in her case, but she hardly noticed. What mattered most was the quiet transformation happening before her eyes. The laughter and doubt of the past replaced by admiration, reflection, and emotional connection. She realized that music was not just about performance or skill. It was about honesty, vulnerability, and the courage to share something personal with the world. A little girl approached hesitantly, holding a small coin in her hand. She placed it carefully in the open case, eyes shining with wonder. The pianist smiled warmly, nodding in gratitude, and let the music flow even more tenderly. Around them, the crowd seemed to lean in, as if the gesture of a single child could amplify the emotional resonance of the performance. Adults and children alike were drawn together, momentarily forgetting the rush of life, united by the language of sound. Time passed unnoticed as she played, lost in the music and the reactions of the people around her. The street, once merely a place to walk through, had become a stage for shared human experience. Every pause, every crescendo, every soft, lingering note carried meaning beyond the music itself. She felt a sense of purpose unlike any she had known before. This was more than survival, more than a way to earn money. It was a way to touch lives, to leave a lasting impression on hearts that might otherwise never pause to notice beauty. She noticed a few new faces in the crowd, people who had never passed by before. One man stood with his arms crossed, listening intently, nodding slightly in time with the music. A young woman tilted her head, eyes closed, letting the melody wash over her. Even those who had been skeptical in the past now seemed captivated. She realized that her courage to play openly, despite the fear of judgment, had created a ripple effect. Her music was no longer just an expression of her own talent and passion. It was a catalyst for connection, a bridge between strangers who had nothing else in common. The hours continued, and she allowed herself to explore the depth of her emotions in the music. She played pieces that were soft and reflective, then shifted to energetic, joyful sequences that lifted the spirits of those gathered. People began to clap along softly, some tapping their feet, and others swaying gently. The street had transformed into a small, vibrant world where music dictated the pace and mood. Even the city's usual noise seemed to harmonize with her performance, creating a symphony of urban life and human expression. During a quiet pause, she looked around at the audience. Some faces were familiar, people who had returned day after day to hear her play. Others were new, drawn in by the sound, and yet all were connected through a shared moment of appreciation. She felt a profound sense of humility, understanding that her music had power not only because of her skill but because of the courage to perform with sincerity. Every person listening, even for a few seconds, became a part of something larger than themselves. A fleeting yet meaningful community formed around the music. She noticed an elderly man standing a little apart from the main crowd, his eyes glistening, a faint smile on his face. She imagined the memories her music might be stirring. Perhaps a song from his youth, perhaps a moment of loss or love long past. She allowed the music to speak to him, and to everyone else with sincerity and openness. Her hands moved over the keys with ease now, guided by emotion and intuition rather than thought. Each note carried intention, and the energy of the street seemed to respond, as though the city itself was listening. As the performance continued, a few people approached her afterward, offering words of gratitude and admiration. One woman said simply, "Your music made me feel something I haven't felt in years." Another added, "I stopped in my tracks just to listen, and I am so glad I did." She accepted their words with humility, realizing that the smallest acts of courage, playing in a crowded street, sharing her music openly, could have profound effects on those around her. The joy she felt was not from applause or money alone, but from the genuine human connection her music created. Eventually, she felt her energy wane, and she allowed the music to slow and soften, letting the final notes linger in the air. The crowd remained for a moment, savoring the end of the performance, before gradually dispersing. Some lingered to say goodbye or toss a few last coins into her case. Others left quietly, carrying the memory of the music with them. She packed her keyboard carefully, her hands tired but her spirit uplifted. Today had been more than a performance. It had been a shared journey, a demonstration of courage, and a testament to the power of human connection through music. Walking home, she reflected on the day. The city had once felt vast and indifferent, a place where she struggled to survive and prove herself. But now, she had experienced the transformation that came from courage, honesty, and the willingness to share her gift openly. She thought about the people she had touched, even briefly, and felt a sense of fulfillment that no material reward could provide. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, as every day did, but she felt ready, strengthened by the knowledge that her music had the ability to create beauty and connection, even in the most ordinary places. The streets of the city, once intimidating and overwhelming, now seemed alive with possibility, and she walked home with hope and determination guiding each step. The morning was quiet, with the city just beginning to stir. She carried her keyboard with care, feeling a mixture of anticipation and calm. Over the past days, her performances had grown from tentative beginnings to something more profound. She had noticed the change in the way people responded, from indifferent passerby to attentive listeners who seemed to connect with her music. Today, she hoped to explore the full depth of that connection, to play with honesty and courage, and to let her talent speak for itself without fear. As she set up on the familiar street corner, she placed her sign reading, "Playing for Food," in front of her keyboard. Her hands hovered above the keys for a moment, taking a deep breath before beginning. The first notes were soft, almost hesitant, as if testing the energy of the street. Slowly, the melody grew stronger, more confident, flowing naturally from her fingers. Passers-by slowed, some out of curiosity, some drawn in by the beauty of the sound. She played with intention, each note carrying emotion, a story of struggle, hope, and determination. The crowd began to form gradually, a mix of familiar faces from previous days and new listeners curious about the music. She noticed the subtle reactions, the pause in footsteps, the soft smiles, the eyes that softened as they listened. A young boy clutched his mother's hand, staring wide-eyed at the keyboard, while an elderly woman stood quietly, tears forming at the corners of her eyes. The music became a bridge, connecting people from different walks of life, momentarily uniting them in a shared experience of emotion and beauty. She allowed herself to play freely, shifting from gentle, reflective notes to more vibrant, energetic melodies. Each sequence of chords seemed to draw people closer, encouraging them to stop and truly listen. Coins and bills appeared in her open case, but she barely noticed. The real reward was in the attention, the subtle gestures of appreciation, and the way her music seemed to transform the street into a place of connection and reflection. The city's usual noise faded into the background, leaving only the sound of the keys and the reactions they inspired. A young woman approached, recording the performance on her phone, capturing the moment to share with others. A man paused mid-stride, his expression softening as he listened intently. Even the teenagers, who had initially approached with skepticism, now watched quietly, their previous chatter silenced by the honesty of the music. She realized that what she had feared most, judgment, laughter, indifference, had gradually transformed into admiration, respect, and shared humanity. Every note she played seemed to ripple through the crowd, creating small, invisible connections that would linger long after the music ended. Time passed without her noticing. She became completely immersed in the performance, letting her emotions guide the music. Memories of her struggles, her family far away, the long hours of practice, and the moments of doubt all found expression in each chord. The crowd responded unconsciously, swaying gently, nodding, or simply standing still, absorbed in the sound. She felt a profound sense of fulfillment, realizing that her music could reach people in ways words never could. It was a silent conversation, a shared understanding, a moment of beauty in an otherwise ordinary street. During a brief pause, she looked around at the audience. Some faces were familiar, returning to listen again, while others were new, drawn by the music alone. A little girl dropped a small coin into her case, eyes shining with wonder, and clapped lightly. A man offered a warm smile and a nod of appreciation. These small gestures were more powerful than any applause, more meaningful than any words. She understood then that courage was not about eliminating fear but about continuing despite it, and that music had the power to create connections that transcended barriers and differences. She resumed playing with renewed energy, allowing her emotions to guide the flow of each piece. The music shifted from tender, introspective sequences to bold, expressive melodies that filled the street with life. Every note was deliberate, every pause intentional, as she wove her story into the air. People responded naturally, some softly clapping along, others quietly tapping their feet, and some simply standing still, absorbing the emotional resonance. The city had become a temporary sanctuary where music ruled, where the rhythm of human connection replaced the usual rush of everyday life. Hours passed, and the crowd gradually dispersed, leaving behind a sense of shared experience and quiet admiration. Some lingered to offer words of thanks or small tokens of appreciation, while others left quietly, carrying the memory of the performance with them. She carefully packed her keyboard, her hands tired but her spirit soaring. Today had been more than just a performance. It had been a demonstration of courage, honesty, and the transformative power of music. She had not only shared her talent but had created moments of connection, touching lives in ways she could not fully measure. As she walked home, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The city, once intimidating and indifferent, now felt alive with possibility. She had faced doubt, skepticism, and the fear of judgment, yet she had persevered. Her music had not only provided sustenance but had offered a deeper gift, the ability to connect, to inspire, and to create beauty in unexpected places. Each performance reinforced her belief in the value of persistence, passion, and courage. That evening, she sat in her small room, tired but fulfilled, replaying the day's moments in her mind. She thought of the faces of the people who had stopped to listen, of the emotions her music had stirred, and of the quiet acknowledgments that had meant more than words could express. She realized that every struggle, every moment of doubt, and every act of perseverance had led her to this point. Her journey was far from over, but she felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, strengthened by the knowledge that her music could reach hearts and inspire others, even in the simplest and most unexpected ways. As night fell, she prepared for sleep, her body exhausted but her spirit renewed. She knew tomorrow would bring new opportunities, new listeners, and new moments of connection. The city was still vast, full of challenges and unknowns, but she had discovered something invaluable: her ability to share her passion openly, to play with honesty, and to touch lives through the language of music. In the quiet of her room, she felt a deep sense of purpose and hope, knowing that her courage, persistence, and love for music had not only changed her life, but had created ripples of beauty and connection in the world around her.